Well, without further ado, welcome to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Yeah!
The motion that stands before this House today is "This House regrets the narrative of the suffering artist." We have some excellent speakers on the proposition, Dr. Alistair Rider and Lesley Franklin. And some excellent speakers on the opposition, Dr. James Fortuna and Miya Turner. I would like to invite the first proposition speaker to start the debate. No? I would like to invite the clerk of the House to read the minutes of last week's debate in the style of Vincent van Gogh.
What am I in the eyes of most people? A non-entity, an eccentric, or an unpleasant person?
Point. You're a suffering computer scientist, not a suffering artist.
Counterpoints. I am a suffering artist. My art is my degree, my muse, Professor James Sally Mapstone.
There seems to be some disagreements in the House. We'll have to take a vote by oral acclamation. All those in favour of taking the minutes as read, say aye.
Aye.
All those against, say nay.
Nay.
It seems rather close. I'll have to consult with my sergeant.
Aye.
The minutes are taken as read.
Aye.
I call the first proposition speaker to give their address defending the motion that stands in their name.
Well, thank you and good evening. Being a commercial gallery owner, you might have expected me to be sitting on the other side of the table this evening, because this narrative of the suffering artist has surely been cultivated by people like me, who know that a good story sells. Everyone loves an underdog who comes good. But I am here to explain why the trope of the suffering artist, whether mentally, physically, financially, or all three, is mythological, exploitative, dangerous, and must be dispensed with. I will show you that there is no evidence of a scientific link between creativity and suffering. Even the poster boy suffering artist, Van Gogh, said, "If I could have worked without this accursed disease, what things like I have done." Let me first explain the mythological aspect. Where did this idea that suffering is not just part of the creative process, but is the creative process, originate? It has been justified by a reference to the works of ancient philosophers such as Plato, who said the greatest of good things come to us through madness. I will come back to this later. The suffering artist really came to the fore in the 19th century when the term artist signified a special person with a whole set of distinctive characteristics. Strange, different, exotic, imaginative, eccentric. This trope was reinforced by authors such as Zola in 1886 in his novel The Masterpiece. The artist increasingly became associated with outsiderness, antisocial behaviour, isolation from others. It has been reinforced non-stop since then. Cézanne faced parental rejection and social scorn. Gauguin threw away respectability and financial security to pursue his calling in the tropics. Toulouse-Lautrec, crippled and alcoholic, sacrificed his aristocratic birthright. Byron, Shelley, Keats, the list goes on. I would, at this point, like to say to you that the suffering artist has traditionally been the prerogative of men. In the 19th century, a woman had socially ordained domestic and reproductive duties which could keep her far too busy to be a suffering artist. Now let me return to Plato. It's my understanding that he considered madness as divine inspiration, which brings me to one of my main points on this Easter weekend. The artist is godlike, is born with a mysterious essence. As Nochlin says, the artist struggles against the most determined parental and social opprobrium like any Christian martyr, and ultimately succeeds against all odds, generally after his death. Artists became martyrs who supposedly suffered to create their art for us. And of course, history of art is still largely dominated by Western Christian-based culture. It all fits the myth perfectly. Okay, let's move on to my assertion that the narrative of the suffering artist is exploitative. I was, as you might know, a teacher for over 30 years. How many times in my career did I hear, "Oh, teaching is a profession. You do it because it's your calling." Well, yes, I did love my job, but why should I not expect financial recompense too? The same is true for artists. Surely artists are entitled to fair pay. The consumer romantically views art as produced by someone who does not do it for the money. The idea that artists are meant to suffer, and the idea that artists are meant to suffer creates barriers to equal pay, and mean that artists might have to give up their art when faced with the constant fear of how to pay the next bill or their rent. The pressure of trying to make their way can cause stress, depression, and obviously make them angry, worried, and frustrated. In this environment, they are, however, still expected to be creative, always. Would you work better if you were paid less? Somehow, a rich artist is viewed as inauthentic, as selling out. On the other hand, powerful institutions have no qualms about making money from artists. The wealthy tend to be patrons of art rather than artists themselves. Exploitation and unhelpful narratives are dangerous, not only financially, but obviously health-wise. There's an implication that mental health struggles of an artist create genius. Hardship guarantees brilliance. But if you're dealing with OCD, with anxiety, with depression, is that conducive to your career, to your output? Yet I read in a recent Van Gogh exhibition that through bouts of illness, he kept on working, creating some of his most famous masterpieces. The conflation of suffering with creativity, the glorification, but also trivialization of mental illness. And this can actually entrap artists into feeling that they must suffer. They start to believe the rhetoric. A 2014 survey in the European Journal of Social Psychology found that the public perceives artists' work as better if told that the artist is eccentric. Psychologists Kahneman and Tversky have found that people generally underestimate the probability of a genius being totally sane and greatly overestimate the probability of an individual with mental illness being creative. In the same paper, it's also explained that people perceive a non-existent relationship between two events simply because they occurred together at some point in the past. And naturally enough, the more vivid the pairing, Van Gogh's ear, the more people tend to enduringly conflate the events and overestimate the frequency of the co-occurrence. This loopy logic then comes full circle with confirmation bias, the tendency people have of confirming their existing beliefs. And the reality is that the vast majority of creative people are not mentally ill, and the vast majority of those suffering psychopathology are not geniuses. Shakespeare, Monet, Pissarro appear, by what accounts we have, to have been reasonably sane, and they did not too badly. I do think that revisionist theory also comes into play. We all know that history is written by the victors. As it happens, I was listening to This Cultural Life with Stephen Fry earlier this week. He basically attributed his skill in languages to his bipolar disorder. But earlier in the podcast, he had mentioned growing up in a literary household, reading from an early age, and listening to comedians on the radio ad nauseum. Might all that have influenced his language skills? In a similar vein, we do know about Van Gogh's suffering because he wrote about it during his lifetime. However, it was after his death that he became famous, thanks to his brother, possibly glamorized his brother's mental health issues. My final reason for regretting the suffering artist narrative is that it confines many artists to oblivion. If you can only be creative through suffering for your God-given gift, where does that leave the majority who have not been gifted artistic genius? Piaget said that intelligence is a dynamic activity rather than a static essence. Much more recently, Malcolm Gladwell claims that it takes 10,000 hours to master a skill. Psychologist Carol Dweck writes about growth mindset encompassing dedication, hard work, and purposeful practice, rather than talent. What about the supposed natural skill of Cristiano Ronaldo when taking free kicks? It might seem natural, but in reality, Ronaldo has practiced over and over and over again, so he knows exactly what the ball is going to do when he kicks it in certain ways. It becomes natural through practice. Going back to our ancient artists, look at the hours of work and devotion from Leonardo da Vinci to create Vitruvian Man, or the 14 years he took to paint the Mona Lisa. And I would hazard a bet that all the geniuses have actually spent hours and hours and hours practicing, reworking, learning. This should be the story rather than stories of suffering. In conclusion, I do regret the narrative of the suffering artist because it's mythological, exploitative, dangerous, unfounded in science, and creates barriers to thousands of artists. I'd like to finish where I started with my role as a commercial gallery owner. I have been guilty of perpetuating the myth. I hosted an exhibition just in March, and I explained that the artist was a recluse, has no telephone, no computer, no telephone. He lives entirely alone and he paints. I did not point out the hours of labour involved, his academic training, and the years he has been refining his technique. So while I am regretting the narrative, I too am guilty of perpetuating it. And this motion this evening has made me re-examine my own rhetoric. The art must endure, not the myth. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their excellent address, and now cross the floor to the opposition speaker to open the House.
I would like to start my speech by thanking the Public Debates Committee for inviting me to speak on this motion. I will admit I'm not nearly as knowledgeable about the artistic world as the rest of tonight's esteemed speakers, but I shall do my best to properly pronounce all the names that I intend to use. I would like to start by explaining what this narrative actually looks like. We hear from the proposition that this is a narrative which encourages us to think that creativity flows from suffering, that the only way in which an individual is enabled to enunciate an idea is if they have previously experienced hardship. I think what this narrative more realistically looks like is the depiction of artists as suffering as a result of the career they have chosen to enter into, not necessarily as a result of the work they have chosen to create, but simply the fact that they have opted into a career which is inherently precarious. This is important to the debate because it allows us to understand what people do to avoid the life of suffering which is traditionally attributed to artists under this narrative. This narrative looks like an education about art, focuses on the experiences of people like Vincent van Gogh and Rembrandt, who all died in poverty, having failed to make a success in the artistic world during their lifetimes. This narrative is the most often directed at people who wish to pursue art, children who want to be artists hearing stories of the suffering faced by the artists ascribed above from their parents and their teachers. What is the likely narrative that would have emerged without that of the suffering artist? Likely a narrative that glorified the experience of artists in contrast to portraying their suffering. This is for a couple of reasons. The first is that artists pursue lives which are too different from the rest of society to be viewed with simple neutrality. People with stable jobs in corporate or government industries are likely to view the lives of artists with great confusion. People who work on one project for months at a time without any guarantee that they'll be compensated are viewed as strange and other by the vast majority of people who care predominantly about securing income stability. This fascination with the unusual lives of artists means that people perceive them very differently to how they perceive regular people and don't believe that their lives could ever be something which is broad and neutral. The second reason why the likely alternative would be a glorification is that the media just finds cases of extremity far more appealing than cases of neutrality. Regressing the narrative of the suffering artist means regressing the way the media focused on stories of artists who have suffered. In a world without this focus, the media would simply focus on artists who were succeeding in their careers. This is much more interesting than writing stories and profiles of artists who are just doing fine. The narrative of the glorified artist would likely be explained by focusing on artists like Monet, Koons and Warhol, who were all able to make stable livings from the world of art within their lifetimes. The impact of this narrative being common is likely that people would have been more encouraged to pursue art as their sole career, something I will explain to be damaging for both individuals and the artistic world later in my speech. Why then do artists suffer more when they work under a narrative which glorifies their experiences? The lives of artists are likely to create a degree of suffering. This means that this narrative is just true, and any attempt to divulge from it means giving people false information about the lives they are opting into. Why does being a professional artist create suffering then? A couple of reasons. Firstly, there exists a massive lack of income stability. Selling pieces of art, which often take months to create, is not a way to create stable income, because you have no certainty of where the pieces you create will ever be sold. The amount of time it takes to create works of art means that artists are unable to know what will be popular at the time of their completion, preventing artists from being able to adequately plan for their future, again leading to this instability. Secondly, there is a large amount of specific, very expensive necessary spending to be able to enter into the artistic world. Artists have to use supplies, things like paints, canvases, sculpting materials, pencils and brushes, all often incredibly expensive and need to be accessed at great cost to the individual. These are especially expensive and difficult to access for people who live outside of established centres of art, like Paris and London. This means that some individuals are notably spending more than others. These circumstances, which make the lives of artists hard, exist on our side as well. What changes is how we approach the issues faced by these artists and how we explain them, and what level of normalisation we ascribe to these negative experiences. Consider the intuition of how I might treat friends who are struggling with their schoolwork. I could tell them that they should be enjoying their time at university, these are the best days of their life and they should feel more positive about the things they are finding difficult. Alternatively, I could tell them that being a student at this university is difficult, that it is normal to struggle with pieces of work. In both cases, my friend still has to submit an essay, but in one, I've made them feel as though they should be ashamed for having issues, and in the other, I've validated their experiences and made them aware that their issues are shared by many, thus making them feel less alone in the ways in which they experience these negative feelings. The exact same principle applies when it comes to the experience of artists. Given I've proven that these artists are likely to struggle, it is better to have a narrative which makes them feel supported than one that makes them feel like an individual failure for having these negative experiences. Why will artists feel worse about themselves, even if the alternative narrative is one of neutrality then, as opposed to active glorification? So people just in general tend to feel as though they are the only ones suffering from a particular issue. We all generally believe ourselves to be far more unique than we actually are. People are also in a world that is increasingly becoming about sharing only the most idealised part of your life through methods like social media, but just the ways in which you are encouraged to sell yourself, most particularly as an artist. You are encouraged to share things about the ways in which your lives are going particularly well. This means that even if you don't believe my explanation about what the alternative is likely to be, even a world in which artists are viewed with simple neutrality rather than a depiction of their suffering is one in which these individuals still feel negatively about the ways in which they are experiencing negative emotions because they feel this to be something which is unique. Sorry, I've been struck down by Freshers Flu Part 3. Importantly, proposition actually make the suffering of artists worse on their side. This is because they convince more people to become artists by perpetuating the narrative that these individuals are going to be more successfully benefited in their lives. And this creates greater competition, which makes it even harder for people to make a living from art. There will necessarily be more art, more people creating works, but the number of people with the necessary money and interest to purchase art remains the same. Prop creates a world with more artists who will feel terrible about the inevitable issues they will experience as a result of existing narratives which paint their lives in an idealistic light. Only the narrative of the struggling artist can make artists feel as though they are not alone when they face a negative experience, thus preventing this group from experiencing severe issues with self-confidence, which can prevent them from continuing their work and ultimately leads to very severe impacts on the individual. Why then does art itself get worse when the artists who create it no longer exist under a narrative of suffering? Firstly, these individuals just feel more ashamed about creating works of art which depict negative experiences. When artists are told by society that their lives are desirable and exciting, they start to self-moderate the art they create to stay in line with this perception. Artists who create depictions of negative experiences worry that doing so subverts the expectation about them to the extent that they may struggle to sell their work. This is really harmful because it means that we get less work which portray the very real human emotions of grief, anger and fear. Art that depicts negative experiences is much more important than art that depicts positive experiences, because art is one of the only ways that people can comfortably engage with negative emotions. Talking about the end of a long-term relationship may be too raw and uncomfortable for many individuals, but viewing art by Frida Kahlo, which shows the incompleteness of a person severed from their partner, provides people in this situation with essential catharsis without requiring them to complete painful self-reflection. In contrast, people are able to express and discuss positive emotions, feelings like love and excitement to their friends, without this being something which is a deeply and internally harmful idea. career. This explains why, even if Prop proves that they get more creation of positive art, we still care more about emboldening artists to create negative perceptions of their lives, insofar as this is the most unique way in which art is able to benefit people. Without artists feeling safe to create these negative works of art, the rest of society is prevented from accessing works which provide us all with a greater feeling of connection to the world around us and catharsis through seeing our experiences reflected in the artistic realm. Secondly, the increased level of competition upon these artists forces them to create and maintain a niche which prevents the development of individual artistic styles. Proposition may say that the increased level of competition that I've characterised creates more dynamism in art by forcing innovation, but art has innovated under the status quo, where we already have the narrative of the suffering artist. What actually happens when artists have more competition is they are forced to create a market niche. This may help with short-term stability, but in the long term it constrains the creative circumstances of that individual. Feeling as though they have to stick to their niche in order to maintain what little stability they have means artists will never evolve their personal style. This means artists will create lower quality works because their primary consideration has become what is marketable in an ever more competitive market, as opposed to what truly speaks to the emotions they're trying to convey. Thirdly, individual artists are no longer encouraged to find other primary employment. The narrative of the suffering artist maintains that artists suffer primarily because of their lack of stable income. Artists who we hear about most predominantly being people who have suffered are people who have died in poverty because individuals were not interested in their works. This is the reason why they suffer, is because they don't have access to stable income. Whether or not it is actually true that this is the reason that artists primarily face suffering, those wishing to pursue art internalise this narrative in a way which encourages them to do things like seek other forms of stable employment, to not rely on art as their primary career. Artists are likely to work in corporate or governmental jobs during the day, thus guaranteeing them stability which enables them to devote their free time to artistic pursuits. There are several reasons why having other employment leads to the creation of better art. The first is that people just have the stability necessary to spend as long as they like on a work of art. Proposition force artists to sell works they're unhappy with, because they stand for a narrative which makes artists believe they can find stability and safety solely in an artistic career. Artists on proposition are unwilling to take secondary jobs, even when they are finding it hard to make ends meet, for fear of being seen as a failure by a society which believes art to be an inherently and internally fulfilling career. Being able to work on art for as long as individuals like makes art higher quality, while also providing more genuine catharsis for artists who no longer have to create streams of personally meaningless art in order to survive. The second reason why we get better art is because we just have art which is created in line with the common experiences of the majority. Spending time working in other jobs outside of artistic careers creates the knowledge necessary to depict these careers in a more broadly relatable way. Artists like Ellis Lowry were able to use their personal knowledge of careers worked during the war to create works which spoke powerfully to the experience of people in the north of England in the post-war period. Personal experiences of the world around you is crucially important for creating art which speaks to the joys, fears and issues of the majority of citizens. Propositions are willing to lie to prospective artists, misleading them by saying that their lives will be easy, while at the same time creating the circumstances which lead to increased competition and a sharp decrease in meaningfully represented art. I care very deeply about art and the people who devote their lives to creating it. That's why I believe that this House and the rest of society ought to recognise their suffering and support the narrative which more broadly represents their experiences. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their excellent address, and I now cross the floor to give the call to the second proposition speaker to give their address and continue the case for the proposition bench.
Thank you very much. In our culture, there's a long-standing tradition that involves looking at artworks for insights into the lives of the individuals who created them. If you've ever visited an artist's retrospective exhibition or read a monograph that's devoted to a single artist, or watched a biopic devoted to an artist's life, then you will be aware just how unavoidable this convention is. The art market is particularly indebted to this model, because the commercial value of the work of art is inextricably linked to the status and reputation of the maker. If you can prove that a painting, for instance, is by Rembrandt, then it will be worth far more than a painting by one of his contemporaries who chose to paint in the Rembrandt style. Of course, you can say a great deal about works of art without talking about artists. You can discuss artistic techniques, styles, how they change hands, how they are displayed, and so on. I'm a historian of modern art, and in some of my research and teaching, this is what I like to speak about. But of course, I also like to talk about artists and what their intentions were, and I'm not against this at all. What I object to, however, are the terms in which creative individuals are often discussed by non-specialists and in the popular media, which is often relentlessly biographical. People are obsessed with the belief that an artist's creative output is a direct expression of their complex inner lives. What I want to emphasize to you today is just how limiting this obsession with the psychobiography of artists can be. I resent the idea that we have to be interested in artists primarily because of the intensity or complexity of their inner lives. And that's a sentence that I've already said, so I will move on. The idea of the suffering artist is part of this. Of course, suffering is an emotional state that's very real and undesirable. You would think that most people would not want to celebrate it as being a desirable element of being an important artist. But its apologists assume that it is a necessary means to an end, and that all great artists have to suffer for their work, for their art. Suffering is, in short, central to conceptions of artistic genius, which is a notion that dates back to classical times. In 1963, Rudolph and Margot Whittaker wrote a highly influential book called Born Under Saturn, The Character and Conduct of Artists, in which they traced many of the common biographical character traits that writers in the West have employed when they discuss great artists. A repeated theme that they uncover is that artists are regularly subject to mania, to dangerous excessive behavior, and that their visionary creative qualities are synonymous with madness. Suffering is integral to this story. The tempestuous artists, the Caravaggios and the Michelangelos, cut an isolated figure who struggles psychologically with their burdensome creative gift. As my fellow proposer Lesley Franklin mentioned, during the 19th century, the narrative of the suffering genius of the artist is rigidly entrenched in popular culture. Furthermore, this figure is increasingly aligned with exclusively male qualities, so much so that greatness in art is universally presumed to be the sole privilege of men. Within this increasingly misogynistic narrative, the cause of artistic suffering is very often attributed to women and to the burdens of domestic life. To be an artistic genius, so this romantic story goes, you have to live outside and beyond the confines of the home. A classic instance of this tale is, as Lesley mentioned, Zola's 1886 novel, The Masterpiece. The protagonist, an unsuccessful painter called Claude Lantier, spirals into obsession and madness when he fails to produce his masterpiece. His suffering, which in his case is self-inflicted and relentless, is a means of accentuating his belief in his inherent difference, his otherness from those around him. The myth of artistic genius culminates at the end of the 19th century, at the very moment when psychology is being institutionalized. Van Gogh is often conceived within this, at this moment, as a paradigmatic artist who suffered for his art. His perceived madness is seen as important because it offers vital clues into the interpretation of his painting, because his madness is seen as part of him being an artist. So what's the problem with this narrative? I see three issues with it. Firstly, it steers us towards one rather specific type of art. It leads us to dwell principally on art created by men who match up to this narrow ideal. Admittedly, there are important 20th century women artists who conform to the suffering artist narrative. I'm thinking in particular of Frida Kahlo or Anna Mendieta. But by attending obsessively to the psychological dimension of their suffering, we overlook the social and gendered causes of their adversity. This is a point I'll come back to, but for now, let me just stress that there are whole fields of art that are just as worthy of our attention and celebration, which stand entirely apart from any story about suffering artists. I'm thinking, for instance, of applied arts, ceramics, design, textile art, fields in which women have a long and eminent history of success. By obsessing over the suffering of a handful of artists, we forget about this other group of artists altogether. Secondly, if you perpetuate the narrative that suffering is essential in order to create visionary art, then you become an apologist for every kind of exploitation that does befall creative workers. Let's not forget that it is extremely tough to earn a living from making art, and only a minuscule fraction of those who graduate with degrees in fine art ever achieve it for the duration of their careers. And artists, like so many others, are susceptible to real-life exploitation and the suffering that this brings. This is certainly not something to be romanticised, and certainly not to be condoned on the grounds that it's an essential rite of passage for being or becoming an artist. Thirdly and finally, moving beyond the blinkered obsession with suffering artist geniuses allows us the opportunity to tell alternative stories about the works of artists like, for instance, Vincent van Gogh. We can speak about how he was a member of a community of creative contemporary individuals and whose art was inspired not simply by his vivid inner visions, but also by the works of his fellow painters, whose styles and compositions he frequently emulated. We can begin to understand how he was participating in a shared cultural conversation about creative expression, inspired by, among other factors, for instance, his exposure to Japanese visual culture, which he encountered in the form of cheap woodblock prints. We can also come to appreciate how he was born into a middle-class Netherlandish family, and how this played a major role in shaping his values and principles, and how he became obsessed with another social class, the French provincial agricultural labourers, who he used as his models during periods when they were unemployed. So, to conclude, if we turn our back on the narrative of the suffering artist, then we open the doors to a much wider array of historical topics. We learn to understand that artists are not isolated suffering individuals, but members of families and members of specific classes and people who come from very particular places. They are, in short, social beings, just as we all are. They're not unique genius individuals. Let's awake from this fairy tale narrative about suffering artists and open our eyes to the diversity of social experiences that artists enjoy. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their excellent address, and now once again cross the floor and give the floor to the second opposition speaker to continue their case for opposition bench.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, for having me. Very grateful for the chance to address you all tonight. We've heard some compelling arguments already, and although my distinguished colleague from North Street has even called our attention to some fairly unduly overlooked artists that I'm glad got some airtime tonight. I want to try to back away ever so slightly from these lofty points, if that's okay with you all. I would like to bring this conversation, in other words, straight back down to street level. And so, what I mean to say is that there are probably worse things than labeling, or even mislabeling, an artist as struggling. What, pray tell, is the alternative? Art and celebrity? This is not a good combination. At least one difference between the struggling bassist gigging around Camden and the film star on larger-than-life posters in Soho, or I don't know, somewhere around Piccadilly, is that our friend in Camden may not consent to having his name, image, and likeness splattered about in the first place. Indeed, she may not even be willing to leave Camden. Whether we want to believe that there are eccentric creatives walking amongst us or not, it is a reality. And while it's true that this may be performative to some degree, that this aversion to status symbols and to material comforts and even to social success is somehow learned and somehow reinforced through cultic reverence for the afflicted creative soul. It does not mean that these people, in many cases, and perhaps to their own financial detriment, turn away from such luxuries. This, I dare say, however ill-placed some of us might find it, this refusal of social convention, the willful attempt to live outside society, as Ms. Patti Smith once put it, is a struggle. But the struggle is better than the alternative. It's better than the quenchless thirst for acknowledgement. It's better than the quenchless thirst for validation, or indeed for market value. So this leads me to my next point. I'm just getting warmed up, so I hope you enjoy your new chair. I do like seeing you in it. To make this point, I need to first remind everyone here that we're actually here to discuss the narrative of the struggling artist and its effects. So not the art, not the artists themselves. What this means is that we're really here to talk about habits surrounding the consumption of art. Make no mistake. We're here to talk about narratives that impact the perception of various means of cultural production. What a struggle it must be to produce art and to have it appraised, to have it scanned, to have it shipped, to have it criticized by strangers the world over, if you're lucky. There is something inherently exploitative about this process, the personal laid bare, all for a price. Even if an artist is given to the type of self-identification that might see them earn the label struggling, it is a reaction to the demands of the market. It's the market that feeds and clothes the artist. So it is the market to which they must listen. Forgive me, but while every investment banker and real estate speculator must do the same, the difference, of course, is that it is wholly unreasonable to expect that anyone in those professions would pour themselves so personally into their craft, into their trade. I've not met a realtor or banker yet who sees the world the way I do, and I sure as anything wouldn't care to see what fills the page were they to sit at a typewriter and bleed, as Ernest Hemingway once described his morning routine in Key West. We cannot fail to recognize that as an artist is as dependent on the cultural and monetary appraisal of their art, they are also dependent on their ability to create in the first place. I just want to be sure, I want to be absolutely clear that we all understand that this is not a conversation about art. It's a conversation about the commodification of art. And if art is supposed to be a reflection of one's relationship to the world around them, or an outward expression of their innermost thoughts, or a stylized reflection of some society or other, that is to say a document, that is to say a timestamp, a trial, a testimony, then we ought to be honest with ourselves about what's behind the impulse. Psychobiography and personalization are not the same thing. So finally, then, I'd like to remind us that time and time again, when we allow our understanding of art and the role of artists to drift too far away from street level, from the ground on which these oft-maligned souls might naturally tread, we create space for further corruption. Not just economic, but political as well. Exploitation by other means. So, photos win elections. Let my accent betray me. Photos win elections. Photos instill fear, but who pays any mind to the propagandist's frame until the shot is sold, until the shot is printed, until the shot is distributed? And what type of agency is the talented photographer afforded when their chance to make rent or feed their family is somehow wound up in the machinations of state? That is to say, the snare of higher powers. We need to acknowledge that elements of creative or cultural production can be co-opted by higher powers, and have been co-opted by higher powers to great effect, and for quite a while. Architectural improvements, urban redesign plans in the interest of social welfare, even in the interest of hygiene, but also as vanity and prestige projects for the powers that be. This tension is real. This tension demands to be acknowledged. It is deserving of our thought, at the very least. How well we know the artist in question is really irrelevant, I agree. But the affliction we're discussing here is universal. And so more superficial in some cases, sure, but the affliction is worthy of our consideration nonetheless. And this narrative, whether we like it or not, was born of truth, and we do well to remember this. I hope it's all right, but I'd like to yield the floor, if I may. Sit down.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their excellent address, and we will now open the debate to the floor. So I'm going to read the script on this bit because no one messed this up. So to catch the chair's eye, please raise your hand. speeches will be 2 minutes in length, and I will bang the gavel once time expires. This week, the best floor speech will receive a prize, which I believe is a £15 voucher to Janetta's. Excellent. Go get some ice cream. And the winner will be decided up here. So, are there any speeches from the floor? Okay, Lewis, please rise and give your name for the minute.
What? I can't think of a fun name. Okay. Stephen. Okay, that's enough. I only had 2 minutes. Completely thrown off. So this is my last ever floor speech in this house, which is quite exciting. But I'd like to start by saying that for me, art is the expression of the human experience. Now, I've never known a human experience to be completely 100% without any form of suffering. Even your act of birth into this world causes your mother suffering. Every single time, that's a bit coarse, but you know what I mean. Every single time you look around, you see suffering. To be an artist that dedicates most of, if not all of their life to creating art, you have to be ready to depict that suffering that happens in your life and the life around you. I can't think of a single artist out there who only produces happy things that's popular. That's boring. People don't like happiness. People don't like simplicity. People enjoy suffering for everyone else but themselves. And they want to see other people suffering and then use that to understand their own. But there's another problem here. And that is the fact that when we look at the performing arts, for example, we see suffering artists, the likes of Robin Williams? Yes. Robbie Williams is still alive. Robin Williams, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Matthew Perry. All great actors, great comedians, who were beloved by millions across the world. And they died from their own suffering. And yet, in the wake of their death, we didn't look at them and say, we need to change things. We fetishized it. We almost enjoyed it. We were happy in a way that we got to see their suffering and feel so sorry for them. And I think that maybe is the problem with the narrative itself. It's the fetishization of suffering. It's the understanding of suffering we need more. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other speeches from the floor? Yes, if you mind standing up and giving your name for the minutes.
Thank you. My name is Ian St. John, and thank you for this great debate this evening. I want to take point really with the opposition who said that the motion today is not about art. And I feel really it has to be about art, because to raise the question of the suffering, the narrative of the suffering of the artist, well, we wouldn't here be debating the narrative of the suffering of the bricklayer or the cleaner. I don't think artists are particularly worth singling out as members of society we should devote a whole evening to discussing. We have to value art for the art itself. And I think that the narrative of the suffering artist is exactly one we would expect, in the sense that an artist, again, going back to what Fortuna was saying, is that in a way they want to make art conform to society. The artist should be a regular person with a 9-to-5 job. There's no particular reason to stand out from society or particularly suffer for their work. But I think that they themselves said that, like, a footballer may spend 10,000 hours to perfect a free kick. Well, if you're spending 10,000 hours to perfect a free kick, you're not back in a domestic scenario, you're not mixing with your friends and family, you are outside society, you're standing out of society, and that places a burden on you. And I think that anyone who wants, if we want to value art as a product, then we want to see, we need someone to speak to us and tell us things that we don't see for ourselves in everyday life. So I think that the great works of art will tend to be produced by people who are outside of everyday society. That's what makes those works stand out. In a world where, as you correctly said, we're bombarded with images, but I've taken 6-7 pictures today, posted them online. My life is too boring to really stand out. But I think people who suffer for their art, people who stand outside society, who feel more deeply and react more personally to that. And I'll give one funny example, is pop singers. When they begin their careers and they're suffering, that's when they produce their great music. Once they become successful, once they move around in limousines and stay in hotels, we all know their artistic impulse diminishes. So I think it is about art today, and I think that great art is produced by people outside society who reflect back to society what they cannot perceive and do for themselves. So I do, in that sense, back the opposition ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other speeches from the floor?
Hi, honey. I want to sort of respond to the previous speech. This just popped into my head as he was talking. Sorry. So I don't have a plan this time. But I do want to amplify or sort of appreciate something that the proposition said and something that the opposition said. I think what's going on here is that the opposition is presenting to us that the suffering is inherent to the role of the artist under which the systems that art is produced. There's an economic system in which art is produced. There's an exploitation in that is inherent to the life of the artist and the afterlife of the artist. And so to talk about the suffering of an artist is at once to talk about their financial burdens, not just because they're choosing a job that's outside, because I think even if you are a kicker and you are spending your life outside the domestic work, you're also, if you have a normal job spending your life outside the domestic sphere anyway, you're going to an office, a normal job, you're going to work outside, spending hours there. That's just the system in which we live. Art needing time like that, if you choose it as a profession, is a profession like any other. But being a profession like any other, and being one in which we privilege a personal narrative around it, there is suffering inherent in the exploitation of that. To that point, I think it's also important to recognize that there are systems that created the idea of suffering financially around art. We had art before we had an artist that suffers outside of art. We had the church patronizing, the Medici's patronizing, the great Renaissance painters. We have we have cathedrals, we have icons, we have statues, we have Michelangelo's David, all these made in religious contexts, all of these made with a different form of, we have the state as well, but like a different form of a structure that is paying for and financially supporting art. And some of the times that doesn't have a name attributed to it. It gets lost in time. It's irrelevant to the wider context, a religious context, a social context in which that art is produced. The narrative of the suffering artist, as the proposition has said before, was created. Is it over?
15 seconds.
15 seconds. Okay, it was created in the 19th century in a time which we shifted away from that model. And in the 19th century, we also had a narrative of other reasons someone may suffer. When people were writing, that narrative of suffering included, and I want to be clear, this was something that I believe the second speaker for the proposition said, women sometimes were part of the reason we created a suffering narrative. Gauguin runs away from his maternity life, runs away from his wife to Tahiti. Picasso goes into his blue face because I had to say.
Thank you. Do we have any other speeches from the floor? Yes, Ksenia.
Hi, my name is Ksenia. Thank you to both sides for your lovely speeches. I have one point really to address to the opposition. I think that you guys could be maybe a bit more generous to this idea of the alternative. Because one of your major claims about why the artist is suffering is the idea of co-option. But I think there's a lot of jobs and a lot of professions in which people's work, in which people are really passionate about their jobs, and they're still co-opted and enforced by other systems. I think it's inherent to just existing in our economy. Look at, for example, professors who have to pander to boards and to get grants for projects that they're really passionate about. So I think the prevailing counter-narrative isn't necessarily one of glorification that necessarily makes people artists feel bad. I think the comparative is one in which you actually you're talking about, for example, you can look at, for example, like these professors as like, their struggle as something that is like, actually, just to clarify this. I think that just because somebody is struggling within their job, that doesn't necessarily mean they are struggling or they dislike or they don't favor their job. What is that to say? An artist may face difficulty in their job, but not be outwardly struggling or may not dislike their job or not see it as poorly. So I think that the difference here is a comparative about like whether or not the artist gets catharsis from the public recognition of the struggle, or whether or not the public recognition of the struggle is something that is like helpful actually to the artist, like recognizing makes their job easier. I'm sorry if that was a bit unclear. I just think that the opposition needs to be a bit more generous in the idea of like, does this struggle actually somehow influence the way the artist produces the art? And in some ways it actually forces artists to focus on the negative aspects of the art rather than maybe talking about the ways that it could actually create joy, even though it is difficult. So even though they may face struggle, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to express it through their art. They can express joy. And I think that is a narrative that the proposition has pointed out quite aptly does impact a lot of artists' work and does make their lives more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go Jenny and then Alex.
Thank you very much. So I think I would like to talk a little bit more about what the proposition have said. I cited the proposition, and I think that they've introduced what to me is the debate, which is the narrative of the suffering artist is inextricably linked to the narrative of the male genius, and inherently the male genius. So when men are driven mad, and specifically when male artists are driven mad, it's because they're being seen to have some kind of intellectual capability, and their understanding of the cosmos and their reflection on society is so apt and so great that it literally drives them to madness. But to be perfectly clear, when women, artists, are driven mad or being seen to be driven mad, it is because of their anatomy and because of their uterus, right? So especially when we think about hysteria, when we think about the 19th and 20th centuries to a certain extent, and we think about madness, we think about women in hysteria, and we think about things coming out of the yellow wallpaper. That's where our mind goes. And that is what is dominating this narrative. And that is why it is so abhorrent, and is why we should oppose it vehemently, especially as we rewrite women into art history, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later on in my speech if I have time, which I don't. So I think also, I would like to talk about the fact that the opposition brought up the idea of consent, and there's artists that struggling in Camden, and whether or not they have the ability to consent to their personal life being spread across everywhere. And I think when we think about women artists, and specifically women artists throughout history, and the narrative of their life after they're gone, their narrative is always controlled by men. Not all men, but always a man, right? That's just how it works. And that is because, as you pointed out, a lot of artists had to rely on the generosity of the other people in their life in order to live. Purely, Van Gogh relied on the support, financial support of his brother. And with women artists, this always looks like either having a sympathetic father or a sympathetic brother or someone who is able to financially support you. And that crucially means that they are in charge of the narrative of your life after you die. And this is inherently problematic because time and time again, they basically fuck it up, right? So you've got, people like Wollstonecraft, whose husband published a sort of monograph or a biopic about her life, which essentially ruined her reputation for years and years and years. Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And as we're rewriting women into art history, don't you dare! As we're as we rewrite women back into art history, and this is only something that we're starting to do in the last 5-10 years, we have to oppose, reject, and dismantle and regret this narrative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alex.
I think that there's a very big difference between correlation and causation. And in fact, Dr. Fortuna, your colleague Professor Kidd once gave me a really long lecture about the difference between the two, which I didn't appreciate, but it sunk in. It really did. And the major problem with the narrative of the suffering artist is this correlation and causation. There is certainly a correlation between suffering and the creation of art, but there's no causation. The narrative, is, as we know it, basically more or less establishes a causation that the artist needs sort of to have a very certain background which comes hand to hand with lots of excessive behavior, but at the same time lots of suffering, and you're fitting a very specific stereotype. And this is just it's wrong. For every suffering artist, I can name you one that was not particularly suffering. But it also tends to, in my opinion, also misrepresent a couple of artists. And I'm going to focus a bit on music, which is the area I know most. But take, really famously, Beethoven, who's arguably a very suffering artist, was abused tragically by his parents in childhood, all the deaf thing. But at the same time, he was also one of the most miserable and rude people that probably ever walked planet Earth. And, eventually this sort of narrative says that, if you're a genius and if you're an artist and you're creating this sort of thing, this behavior it's fine. And actually, thankfully, I think we've arrived at a stage where slowly this sort of thing has started to being overcome. And I think it was 2 years ago, a very famous conductor, Neville Gardner, slapped someone during rehearsal. And he was stripped of all his positions because, guess what? All the genius and the excessive behavior in the world doesn't mean that you can do whatever the heck you want to create art, because there are many, many people who do create art without really fitting this mold, and there's just, might be a correlation, but there's no causation.
Thank you very much. We have a tiny bit of time left, so if there are any other speeches from the floor. Yes, Ian.
So thank you everyone for your speeches today, and I'd like to address the proposition, and there are points that the first proposition speaker brought up at the end of their speech, which is about the art industry and how they almost abuse this narrative of the suffering artist to sell art. And you painted this as a negative, but I'm not sure it necessarily is a negative, because although it might seem a slightly immoral way to do it, it still is a growing of the art industry, and the growing of the art industry, I think most people can agree, is a good thing. Galleries like to, I guess, paint a picture. I'm quite proud of myself for paint a picture of the suffering artist for a reason. People like to look at art and think they're seeing something more than maybe there just is. They can see a picture which is beautiful, but then also see into the suffering of artists, as we saw in the second for all speakers, kind of address of how people almost look for this suffering. And has this not helped the industry in a way? Is it not a positive thing? I wonder if you could talk about that.
Thank you. Owen.
Okay, I'm going to do the competitive debate speech. Main question to Prop is that I think we get this interesting idea of artists feeling entrapped within these narratives because they're seen as like, to be good at art they have to suffer. And I wonder if we could get some more illustration from Prop on kind of how this kind of entrapment actually manifests in the decisions that artists make within their lives and how that then affects them as individuals. And second of all, that given it's probably true that artists will still face the innumerable financial barriers on your side with or without this narrative, why this is the kind of big thing that's actually going to make a difference in their life getting rid of this narrative. When questioning to Prop, I think that the counterfactual, you kind of analyse one side of it but not the other. So like on the idea of why Prop are wrong that Prop are wrong, what was I going to say here? That it's not that it's about artists and suffering being sort of intrinsically linked and that's good for art. Why that's in fact an incorrect idea and your push is correct, given that op have like the empirics to back their claim up and actually some degree of definitional fiat.
Thank you very much. If there's nothing else, then thank you everybody for your contributions. And it's now time to bring the debate back to the dispatch boxes. So each bench will get 10 minutes to give their reply, which can be split equally or however they like. So I now give the call to the opposition bench to give their reply. How would you like to split your time?
Do you want to do 5 and 5?
No.
You want me to take 10 minutes?
I think you're ready to go.
I don't know anyone else wants to hear me speak for 10 minutes. Go for it. I'll give the preemption that I always give, which is I'm not a responsive speaker, so I'm sorry if I miss something. Okay, I'm literally just going to go through and explain the points I think we hear from the proposition bench, then address some of the floor speeches and the points contained within them. So, to the proposition, the first point that we hear is that there is no sort of genuine psychological connection between suffering and creativity. I think I would like to push back a little bit on the necessity of this being true for the debate to take place. I think this is a narrative which does broadly exist outside of the scope of scientific definitions. This is about how society in general perceives of artists and how we depict their experiences. Probably it is completely accurate that there is no scientific connection between any of this, but as is true in most of the world, we can have discussions about things where we have no evidence for anything. Secondly, to address the very real and very important point in this debate about how most suffering artists have been men and the way in which this is necessary to exclude female artists from the conversation. Unfortunately, this would have been the case no matter what the narrative that we ascribe the experiences of artists to would have been. Men have always been in positions of power, most historically in artistic positions, largely because of a disregarding for the talent of women, and I just unfortunately don't believe that this would have changed regardless of what narrative we ascribe to the ways in which individual artists perceive themselves or how we as a society perceive artists as individuals. Secondly, I think this narrative is actually one of the ways in which female artists are able to gain a degree of recognition by using their individualized suffering as a way in which they are able to have some sort of unique point within the artistic world. Is this exploitative? Potentially, but women have always been exploited, and what matters is how they're able to use this exploitation, a world in which people are able to use the exploitation and the suffering they experience to create art which is more easily received by the rest of society, is probably one in which these women get somewhat more exposure than they would have done otherwise. Thirdly, proposition talk about how people are far too interested in psychoanalyzing artists. This in their second speech. This is probably true. Unfortunately, this is something which isn't exclusive. That is, it doesn't matter what narrative we ascribe to these artists. People will always be interested in psychoanalyzing them because artists are different from the rest of society. They're interesting. We do believe them to be creative geniuses, whether or not this is accurate, whether or not this is something which is helpful, and is something that people in the general population believe. So psychoanalyzing happens anyway. It's about what we would prefer. We are psychoanalyzing about these individuals, what narrative we believe to be more important to discuss. I think we've made the case quite clearly on opposition that this is a narrative of the suffering artist. Fourthly, and very interestingly, we hear a point from the second proposition speaker about how this narrative makes us apologists for the abuse faced by artists insofar as we romanticise it and glorify it to a degree. But I would push back on this slightly to explain that I think the narrative of the suffering artist is the reason why we're able to have such conversations in the first place. That is, a counter world in which you don't have this narrative which explains that artists are likely people who have suffered, is a world in which people are not encouraged to express the suffering that they have experienced, or to express the ways in which they themselves have experienced negativity in the world of art. This is probably, again, not a world in which we're able to solve everything. Neither world likely is, but it's a world in which we have the conversations that are the important prerequisite for accessing that change in the future. I don't know where this is from. This might be from a full speech. To explain why, this is from a full speech. To explain why the suffering has been created by abusive structures, power structures which existed that created that suffering, and this is something that ought to be reckoned with in this debate. This is very interesting and likely very true. We know that this is a construct in this debate about how we know that the ideas in this debate have been constructed by particularly powerful institutions, and I think why it's especially important to recognise the suffering of artists is far as the suffering they are suffering under has been a result of these powerful institutions, something that again deserves attention in this debate. Then we hear a point that people who have other careers also face negative circumstances. Ksenia is completely correct, but the catharsis of artists is important. Only for you, Ksenia, I have two responses. The first is, I already have weighing in my speech, I think you'll find. They explain why negative art is more important than positive art, even if you care about the creation of this as being a direct comparison. Secondly, there's also just weighing on scale, which is to say that perhaps the catharsis experienced by individual artists and the art that they create is important, but what probably is more important insofar as the number of people it benefits, is just having artists who create things which meaningfully impact the lives of the people who view it. So even if this does encourage artists to create art which more closely depicts examples of their suffering rather than of their glory, this is probably something which is just more relatable and therefore more accessible and beneficial to the individuals who watch this art. Therefore, on scale, Ksenia, I am weighing above your point. Then to address Jenny's speech on women and the issues which they uniquely face and the way in which this narrative has been co-opted and controlled by men. I agree with this wholeheartedly. I agree also that most narratives in history have been controlled by men. Indeed, most of female experiences have been. I think this is again a narrative which probably does not benefit women particularly strongly, but also probably doesn't take away from them any more than any other narrative would have done. I think the conversation about women in this debate should be more focused on the ways in which women have contributed to an artistic tradition which focuses on suffering, and less about the ways in which women have just been abused by men in this capacity, insofar as this is unfortunately a truth and reality we have to accept about the artistic world. Men, will always have been valued more in artistic spaces historically. I completely agree with all the floor speeches that speak to the need to currently address a rewriting of artistic history to include female voices, but this is something that this narrative absolutely doesn't prohibit, and is something that indeed, I believe, as mentioned earlier, has actively given us a route into explaining this, insofar as it encourages us to think about the ways in which women and people who have uniquely suffered as a result of their circumstances are able to depict these experiences in art to great effect. Then to Alex's speech about how there is no correlation between the causation of, this is too long science words for me, Alex, I can't do it, no correlation or causation between the experience of suffering and creativity? Yes?
No.
Okay. I'm going to respond to that one anyway, and then you can argue with me about it later. So thank you very much, Alex, for prompting me to do some decent weighing, even if this does not in any way address your point, which I imagine that it doesn't. So perhaps this narrative does hurt those artists who do not themselves suffer and are told that their experience is one in which they should. But quite literally, these people are just not the most important artists. The most important artists, the ones whose experience we should care about protecting the most, are the artists who do experience a degree of suffering. It's just nicer for these individuals who suffer under situations in which they have poor finances, in which they feel as though they have been abandoned by society, society which does not value their artistic pursuits. It is more important for these individuals specifically to be protected by a narrative which tells them that their suffering is something which is not exclusive, that many others suffer and they're not alone. And this is just something which creates the community that enables these people to heal. So this is important. Even if it is true that some artists are harmed by this narrative, the people who are helped are the more vulnerable people, insofar as the people who themselves are experiencing external issues. Then to Ian's explanation about why the expansion of the art world is a principal good. I actually think this is fairly unintuitive. I think the expansion of the art world is good insofar as it creates art which more meaningfully connects to the experiences of individuals. Insofar as my speech explains why we think that competition is something which often creates worse quality art by encouraging people to create niches, by preventing individuals from accessing the art that they find to be truly meaningful, and in general just increasing the suffering insofar as it prevents individuals from being able to access stable income. Within the expansion of the art world is something which is not necessarily just inherently a good for the reasons explained in the speech. Then to Owen's point about definitional fiat, Owen is correct. Proposition are able to fiat what we think this motion looks like. But insofar as throughout the debate entirely, we've had an evolution of the ideas about what this definition looks like. A recognition throughout the entirety of proposition bench that part of this debate does include us discussing whether or not these artists are people who have suffered independently of whether there is genuinely a scientific correlation between suffering and creativity. I think it is fair for us to introduce this level of counterfactual. But notice also, Owen, some of my arguments are not reliant on you believing my counterfactual analysis. So in which case, they are still able to access our impacts about why individuals themselves perceive themselves negatively, even if there is not a narrative which encourages them to do so. For the reasons given, people have low self-confidence, people inherently believe that they are more exclusive than they actually are, and this means that people will always think of themselves as being more unique, therefore they will think that they have experiences which are unique, and that is the reason why they often feel worse, even if my counterfactual analysis is not bought, which very fair enough, perhaps I do not have the institutional fiat that I claim that I do. Thank you very much for listening to 20 minutes of me speaking, I'm so sorry. Thank you for the rest of the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left if you're happy to yield.
You have 2 minutes if you'd like to speak.
No, I'm quite all right, thank you.
Well then we'll cross the floor again back to the proposition to close the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to share.
I'll gather you at 5 minutes.
Okay,
so
great, thank you. So I'll pick up some of the points. First of all, coming to the fact you said at the beginning that financial challenges, should we, you likened it to university, should we say it will be hard, and that, so that artists would feel that they're in a similar circumstance to everyone else, and therefore that makes it okay. I would say that does not make it okay. You're just leaving people who are being exploited, anyone in society. You could say that about any marginalised group. Oh, they're all together. They'll feel better if they're all together and they're all marginalised. We'll just say to them, oh, it's going to be tough. Hey-ho, let's get on, and just leave them there feeling that it's tough. So I don't think that that's a legitimate reason to not help artists, to just say they'll feel better if they're all in the same boat. Talking about, coming back to Ian's point on the floor where you asked me directly about why is it a problem for someone like me to exploit artists, it's a problem for the artist, and I would feel embarrassed and guilty if I was exploiting an artist to that extent. Yes, I need to make some money in order that I can, I've got overheads, I've got lighting, heating, I have to, produce catalogues, I have to employ people. For all of that to happen, I need some money. But I'm not going to exploit the artist to such an extent that they can't make a living. That's not fair. Why should an artist not be paid? So I don't think it's fair for the artist. And the overriding point for me in all of this is that why is it bad for the artist? It's a person's life, it's their mental health, it's their living. Why should they not be paid? Going back to the footballer analogy, yes, Ronaldo spends hours and hours, he gets paid. The artists don't get paid for spending their hours and hours and hours on their practice. So what needs to change is the system. If we accept the narrative, we are accepting that artists are exploited, that it's fine for artists to have poor mental health, it's fine for them to not make a living, it's fine for them to have to work in the evening. Can you work in the evening if you've been busy all day? I don't think you're going to be at your most creative if you're told, oh, you can only work overnight because you've got to be a waitress all day because you're just an artist, you don't deserve to be paid. So it's not fair on the artist to expect them to do other jobs. You don't expect other professions to do other jobs and then do their job at night. You're relegating the art to being a hobby then, rather than a profession. So I think we need to give artists the status that they deserve. That means changing the system that I'm part of, and that's something I can do in a small scale, but that's what needs to happen. So we need to change it for their mental health, for their well-being, for women, because that was a very good point you made, and art history has traditionally been written by men. The narrative is still controlled by men, as we've heard. Men in the past have blamed, going back to Zola with the masterpiece, he blamed the woman. She caused his distress. So we can't have that kind of narrative existing. It's just completely unfair on these people, as everyone is an individual. We can't leave people to be marginalised and forgotten. So I think that's enough from me. I'll pass over to Alistair to pick up some other points.
Thank you very much. One idea that was shared was that really good art requires a certain set of experiences in order to generate quality. And I sort of find these arguments a little bit problematic because they are declamatory about what quality looks like. And that's not something that is straightforwardly explained. Quality is one of the most elusive categories in any conversation about art, and it's not a great axiomatic position from which to begin a conversation. But another thing which I really want to speak to you all about in the remaining minutes is this fundamental underlying question or assumption that we've all kind of made, which is that individuality is somehow central to everything. And whenever we start talking about artists, we instantly imagine an individual. And that individual is depicted as somehow being separate or aloof or apart from society. I think it's very important to combat individuality as a principle in my academic work. And I much prefer to celebrate what we have in common, sociality, and sociability, and to emphasize that when we think we're being very individual, we're actually being at our most social. And when we, for instance, think about expression, we have an experience and then we express it in art. In a way, that experience is perceived to be very unique to you, but you cannot communicate that unless you are using a language which is shared, which is common to a group. If you're an artist, you have to embrace a genre which has an established tradition which precedes you. And if you speak in a language which nobody understands, your emotion will be incomprehensible. Then also we talk about people living outside society. But there's nothing more sort of socially conformist than wanting to live outside of society. It's a position that society generates for particular individuals to occupy. And ever since the Desert Fathers and the aesthetics of the 4th century in Christianity, it's those who live outside society who give society a kind of face and allow it to become understandable. So I would not say that the hermit is aloof or apart from the community who sustains and pays for the food that he or she consumes. It's part of the infrastructure of a community. And anyway, finally, why do we assume that artists should have a monopoly on creativity in the first place? Aren't we so frightened of our own creativity that we outsource it to special individuals who we hero worship and say they need to suffer for this attribute? Why can't we just celebrate creativity wherever it arises, among artists or among ourselves? Isn't that a more pleasant narrative to pursue than this idea of uniqueness and individuality? And as a way of ending, I'd just like to say that art is far more diverse than you guys think. And artists assume many different forms and come in many different guises than you might think. And that if you go to an exhibition of contemporary art, all these ideas about safe expression and so on that you've shared tonight don't really add up. Art is doing so many different things. It's made collaboratively, it's made under circumstances that are profoundly different from what we might assume. And we need to open our eyes to its diversity. And if we subscribe to very particular limited narratives, little tropes and expectations and assumptions about what the artist has to do in order to be great and good, then we're ignorant or overlooking all the other wonderful types of expression that exist in the world. Thank you.
I thank the speakers for their excellent addresses, and indeed all members of the House who have contributed to the fine debate we've had this evening. So it's now time to call the House to a vote. So please raise your hand nice and high, and if you side with the proposition, that is that this House regrets the narrative of the suffering artist, then please raise your hand.
Are we allowed to raise our hands?
And with the opposition?
I call.
Oh, sorry. Whoops. Any abstentions?
Liberals.
The floor speech prize goes to the gentleman in the back row. So, the ayes to the right are 11, and the nays to the left are 9, with 8 abstentions. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it.